Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have something very special on the bench. This is Matt's Breguet Type 20 from around the 1950s. It's got a very nice black dial. I see the case is in very good condition as well. These watches were originally meant for the army, for the French one specifically, and then they had engravings on the back saying Type 20, so this is a civilian version. The Type 20 should have a flyback chronograph function, which means that if you press the reset button while the chronograph is running, the chronograph hands should reset to 0 and immediately start running again. But keep an eye on the subdial at 9 o'clock for the small seconds. Let's see that again. There. You see the seconds hand stopped when we press the reset button. So that means something is not correct with this watch. And if we let the seconds hand run past the half mark, we see that the reset doesn't do anything at all. It kind of makes the minute counter reset. But yeah, something is not good here. The watch runs pretty okay. Note that the lift angle is 52 degrees here, it should be 48. So this is likely more like 250 degrees. So we're gonna do something about that. But it looks alright otherwise. Let's open the watch up. We expect to find the Valjoux 225 inside with a flyback lever. But there is no lever. There are quite a few service marks, but yeah, it's a bit puzzling that the lever is missing. Well, let's then take the movement out of the case. This movement has one clamp that's sort of in the middle of the movement, so it's a little bit odd. We'll manage. So the hands were reloomed at some point, but the numbers on the dial are radium. So the noise you can hear in the background here is a fume extractor, just to protect myself a little bit while doing this. I'm also wearing a mask. With the hands off, we can take the dial off, and this dial is taken off from the bottom of the movement. So the old style way of doing it. So under the dial we find the hour counter mechanism, and we also find that this is actually a Valjoux 71 movement. So it's not the 22 or 22.5. So that also explains why there is no flyback. But we will make one. We're going to take off all the parts on the train side. So you saw me let down the mainspring, and then we can take out the balance. I mentioned that this watch should have a flyback. In watches that do not have a flyback, there should be a little beak on the hammer that butts up against the column wheel so that the hammer cannot be moved while the chronograph is running. But the hammer on this one does not have that beak, and yet it still lacks the eccentric it should have for the flyback lever. I mentioned that this watch belongs to Matt, and Matt also owns the Omega 33.3 that I did a while ago. He has a very nice collection of watches, but he was a little bit fooled when buying this one. He got it for a good price years ago, but he does acknowledge that not everything is as it should, but it does then want me to implement the flyback function. So that's going to be the main thing we're going to do in this video. We're going to make parts, and we're going to implement the flyback function in this watch. Now Matt is a very smart guy and also a serious and experienced collector. But there's a good rule in life that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably isn't true. And it seems to me that someone went through a pretty elaborate hoax to make this watch look like flyback. I believe they filed off the beak on the hammer. And then if you demonstrate the watch with the chronograph seconds hand before the 30-second or halfway mark, it will look like the flyback is working. So I think that's what happened here. And while talking about that, we managed to take off all the chronograph parts on the train side. So we're going to continue with dismantling the base movement. So it has been a long time since my last video. I hope this one will make up a little bit for that. As I wrote in a post as well, I had a terrible hard disk crash, so I lost a lot of data. I did actually lose a lot of footage for this video as well. You'll see that when we get there. One of the things I did was I had a little vacation, and saw one thing I thought was very funny, so I need to share that with you guys. We were driving along in Switzerland on a little trip, and then we somehow ended up behind a bus. It was a tourist bus. And the label on the bus was Umbrella Holidays. So it sort of struck me that, yeah, I'm not really sure I would like to go on holiday with Umbrella Holidays. It's like you book your flight with a stomach flu vacations. Not really very promising. The arrow counter mechanism is very similar to the one you'll find in module 72. I'm honestly not a big fan of this way of implementing it, but that's how they did it. And with that off, we can then take off the keyless works and almost get ready for cleaning the movement. So as mentioned, this seems to be a pretty elaborate hoax, movement-wise that is. The dial seems genuine. The case and bezel as well, even though they're not exactly the right combination. Let me know in the comments if any of you have ever bought something you thought was something else than it was. Be very interesting to know. We're going to put the balance back on for cleaning, and then the last thing we have to do, or pretty much always say that, but it's not really the last thing. We do have to disassemble the underside of the 3/4 bridge. That's where the winding system is. But we're also going to take out the mainspring. And we're going to clean the pivots of the wheels. First thing though is that we're going to peg all the jewel holes. It has been a while since this watch was serviced, that's for sure. And we see a really old mainspring inside there. You can tell that by the color. This purple color was used a long time ago. And when we finally get it out, we'll also see that it's of the old spiral mainspring type. It's been a while since those were made. Alright, let's clean the barrel. And there's also a few other parts we're going to clean. We're going to clean the pivots of all the different wheels. And later on you'll also see me clean some other parts. I did mention that I lost some footage, and actually pretty much lost all the footage of the assembly of the base movement. So after cleaning, we're going to skip straight to the part making. I did include a short video of the time grapher just to show that the watch runs very nicely. But if you want to see how to assemble a chronograph, then I'll have to refer you to other of my videos. I also want to really thank my members, both on YouTube and Patreon. It's been a long time while I've been struggling with a lot of things. I haven't been as active as I really want to be. So thank you so much for that. We have a really nice community on the Discord with the members. discussing various things about tools, about repairs, tips and tricks, resources, that kind of things. There are different membership tiers, and you can see the different benefits there. If you click on the join button below, you will get a box showing those, or you can also go to Patreon at this URL. So as mentioned, I lost pretty much all the assembly footage, but here is the watch running. It's running quite nicely now. So in a flyback chronograph, you need to be able to reset. So basically put the hammer onto the different counters while the chronograph is running, and then let it start again. So to do that, we need to first make this lever here. This lever will disengage the clutch when the reset button is pushed. The lever pivots on top of the intermediate minute counter wheel. So we're going to have to make a screw that presses those together. And that screw has to be hollow because the whole assembly needs to pivot on a post in the 3/4 chronograph bridge. There is a post in movement now, but we need a thicker and a little bit taller one to counter for the extra force from the lever. And finally, we need to have something that pushes on the lever so that the lever can disengage the clutch, and that's with an eccentric screw in the hammer. So in total we need to make 4 parts. We're going to start with the eccentric that we need to put in the hammer. Luckily we have an extra hammer with an eccentric. That's for a different watch, so we cannot just take it. We can take the measurements, so that's what we're going to do. If you're not familiar with what an eccentric screw is, it's basically an offset screw like this. What we're going to make is not a screw per se, it's a plug, but with a screw head. So that when we use a screwdriver to rotate it, we can adjust the depthing between the 2 different parts. So in chronographs there are typically at least 3 eccentric screws, and we're going to make it 4. See, the part is pretty small. The head is 0.9 millimeters and the eccentric plug is 0.5. We're going to use blued steel for this. That should be strong enough. A bit tougher to machine, but that's okay. We're going to first make a holder for the steel part that we're going to make an offset in. And I do that simply by putting in a 0.5 millimeter thick plate on one side in the 3-jaw chuck. And then when you drill a hole, that will be offset by 0.5 millimeters. After doing that, I use my slitting saw and I cut a slit in the brass. Then you get a little bit springy effect. So it's going to hold this steel pin nicely in place. Then we're going to put the brass holder into a collet and put this pin that we're cutting now into the holder, and then we can cut the eccentric. Here we have the holder in the collet, and then we're going to put the pin in, and then we can cut the eccentric. You're going to see that it rotates a little bit off center, about 0.5 millimeter then. And that means that when we cut on our lathe, we're going to create an offset plug underneath, thus an eccentric. Then we're cutting this pin off to a length, and then we're going to cut the screw head slot. We'll do that with a slitting saw on the lathe. You could also do this with a handheld slitting saw. I'll show that a little bit later. It is nicer on the lathe like this. The blade was a little bit too thick, but it should be alright. Then the last part we're going to make on the lathe is the hollow screw. So we're just cutting it to the right thickness. And then we're going to thread the outer part of it, and then also drill a hole all the way through. I'm using a threading plate for this. There are other ways to do it as well, but these are very, very small parts. So finding threading dies for sub 1mm parts is not that easy. These threading plates typically have 2 slots per size. So one is to get, let's say, the rough cut, and the other is to make the finer cut later. I also use these threading plates for cleaning up old screws, and they work pretty well in general. The last part to make then is the lever itself. I cut a hole in a piece of steel, 0.4 millimeters, and then I cut it to a very rough shape. I'm going to use some Dychem blue to be able to outline the cut that I want to make. And the reason is that the steel is so hard that a normal graver will not make any outline in it. But with a coat of color on top, we can get a nice outline. Well, this is still a few hours of filing. I have to go back and forth because if we file too much, we cannot put it back on. So then we would have to start all over again, and that's not cool. And yes, some might say I'm lazy, like my wife. But anyway, we're going to speed this up, and after a long time of filing, measuring, going back and forth, we finally have our parts done. Let's just zoom in to see the size. Here is a normal ballpoint pen. So these things are not big. So with that, we can start reassembling the chronograph. And yes, it's a new day, so my voice is a little bit different. So I screwed in the new post. You can see it there, nice and shiny, right next to the column wheel. That's a column wheel chronograph. Of course, Valjoux might be best known for the 7750 nowadays, which is a cam-shifted one. But the column wheel ones are much smoother to operate and, yeah, more expensive and difficult to make. Which is why the 7750 is so popular, because it's cheap to make. Speaking of voices, so my daughter just had her 8th birthday, and during her celebration we got a helium balloon, and then it broke, and then of course I took the opportunity to inhale the helium and go from this kind of voice to "Is this a Kids just love that. It's kind of funny. So most of the parts in this watch are in good condition. There is a little bit surface rust here and there, which we will see. But overall, the watch is in good condition. Not excellent, but good. So what we're doing now is we're assembling the clutch. The way these old chronographs work is that this wheel in the red ring here is the chronograph driving wheel. The chronograph driving wheel is always rotating. It's directly connected to one of the wheels in the wheel train. And it's always also connected to the clutch. And the clutch, as the name then implies, is the wheel that engages or disengages with the chronograph counter. And then we can use this hollow screw to assemble the lever together with intermediate minute counter wheel and put that on the post. So the flyback lever does make it a little bit extra complicated to fit the other parts. There are quite a few springs we need to put in for the brake, for the intermediate clutch wheel, and then ultimately also for the hammer itself. And with the parts for the flyback in place, we now just need to be able to push on the lever so it disengages the clutch. To do that, I first took off the screws on the hammer, drilled a hole, putting those screws back. And to put the eccentric in, I'm using a little bit of beeswax because it's very tight in the hole. It needs to be tight, of course, so it doesn't rotate freely. That would not allow you to keep the depthing proper. The hammer needs to fit in under the flyback lever, So I'm going to make some space for it, and then we can put in the rest of the chronograph function. This central wheel here is the chronograph seconds wheel, and then the wheel on the left is the minute wheel. So then we can put in the reset or flyback lever here, and then the operating lever goes on top. So a little bit of layered construction, more than usual. That's how it is. You have to be careful when we're putting in the chronograph bridge here. Don't want to break any pivots. Before the hammer will work properly, we also need to put in the spring for it. And do a little bit of lubrication. Alright, let's see if it actually works then. We see the eccentric on the hammer pushes on the lever, which disengages the clutch as the hammer resets the counters. So with that in place, we can then turn to the dial side. I did take apart this assembly for the hour counter mechanism. It was a little bit rusted, but I'm not showing that to keep the video not too long. So the way the hour counter works on this mechanism and on the most is that there's a wheel that directly transmits the rotation from the barrel. So there's a calculation basically on how many times the barrel turns per hour, and then those teeth are cut to reflect that. This is that wheel. And then of course there's a clutch to engage or disengage with this intermediate wheel, and then finally this hour counter wheel. This is just a little plate to hold those wheels down. Very reminiscent of the 72. And then you have a couple of these small tension springs. Now these tension springs is what often causes problems with the hour counter mechanism of Volju watches of this kind. So we might have to adjust that a little bit after testing the watch. So I didn't talk too much about the history of the watch, and also of course the history of the company Breguet. For the watch, the Type 20 is actually still being made, and nowadays it's with an in-house movement. And that's of course what you sort of would expect from a Breguet watch. But given that this watch or these types of watches were produced on request or order from the French military, they did use more or less off-the-shelf movements as this one. Of course, Breguet, named after the founder, the most famous and possibly the best watchmaker ever, Abraham Louis Breguet. He founded his company in Paris almost 250 years ago. Breguet himself is often thought of as a French watchmaker, but he was actually born in what's Switzerland today, in Neuchâtel. Back then it was actually part of Germany, or Prussia rather. But he did stay most of his time in Paris, which is also probably why a lot of people think of him as a French watchmaker. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Breguet, but we're first going to put on the dial. And we're actually going to case the watch before putting on the hands. That way we can use the pushers in the case to help us position the chronograph hands. So I mentioned that this watch is a bit of a Franken. So the bezel is not correct either, but Matt got a correct bezel for it. So we're going to take off this one using a bezel tool. This one I got from China. Works perfectly well. These rotating bezels have a spring on the underside that we can then squeeze together with this tool, and then the bezel comes off. And then we're going to put on the correct one. Of course, going to clean the case first. So first we take off the spring for the bezel. And then we can take out the crystal and the pushers. And here we get to another snag. And that is that this case wasn't actually made for an hour counter mechanism. When you have an hour counter, you have basically one lever on the dial side and one lever on the train side of the movement. And those two levers basically meet in the middle, and that's where you want the pusher to then push. But in this case, that's not really where the pusher pushes, so we're going to have to think of something for that. Let's first take off all the gaskets and pushers and springs, and then clean the case. Now, if you don't know, the ultrasonic has a very unpleasant sound, not unlike scratching on the blackboard, so brace yourselves. Before talking a bit more about Breguet, I wanted to just have a look at this one screw for the pushers. You can see that the screw head is a bit worn, so there's not much grip for the screwdriver. So I'm putting the screw in the pin vise with a square head, so it can easily be held in the vise. And then we can use a handheld slitting file to deepen that screw slot a little bit. And that works just fine. Also going to put a little bit of silicone around the ridges in the pusher tubes. Makes the pushers a bit more smooth. And then we can put them together. So getting back to Breguet, his business was family owned for a long time. Eventually it became a part of Swatch Group just a couple of decades ago. And it's now kind of the top dog there in terms of luxury watches. But Breguet's name lives on not just in the brand, but also in things like the Breguet overcoil. Even though he was not the first one to make an overcoil, it's got his name. Just interrupting this broadcast with a quick update on this reset pusher. We have to make it a little bit bigger. So I cut a hole in a little piece of bronze and filed it to size, and then we put it on the screw again. And that way I hope to reach both the dial side and the train side reset lever. And now we continue our broadcast of the Breguet history. Breguet is also known for the tourbillon, of course, even though he probably didn't invent it, but he did implement it in the first watch. Tourbillon was likely invented by John Arnold, who was also a good friend of Breguet. And probably lesser known, or at least lesser talked about, is the fact that Breguet actually invented the automatic winding mechanism and also shock settings. And those are two extremely important innovations for watches. And of course the great George Daniels was very much influenced by Breguet. So if George Daniels thinks Breguet was good, then yeah, I think we can agree on that. So we've gotten to the hour hand. As you will also have seen, I did put on a different crown. That crown is actually not correct. I should have kept the original crown, so I will have to do that before giving the watch back to Matt. The crown is a Breguet crown, but it is not correct for this type of Type 20. And speaking of not correct, I think I've spoken about that quite a lot actually in this video. The hour and minute hand and also chronograph seconds hand is not correct either for this Type 20. They are Type 20 hands, but not for this specific reference. Another thing to mention as well, Matt is very much an originalist. He doesn't want too much done to the watches apart from just servicing and repairing if needed. The case on this watch is in very nice condition, so I wouldn't do anything about that. There is a pretty sizable scratch in the case back and also a few small dings, but that's fine. I'm very much a proponent of keeping watches coherent, and this dial has its battle marks, so to speak, so I think the watch should look it also. We actually see that the minute counter snaps over a couple of seconds too early. I did adjust that a little bit. You can move the finger on the chronograph wheel for that, but it wasn't possible to get it entirely right. That's just how it is. So we are going to put on the case back, and we're almost ready to see the watch on the wrist. As mentioned, Matt was able to find the correct bezel for this type. And even though the crown is then the incorrect one now, I will put on the correct crown again later. And there we go. Beautiful Breguet Type 20. Before seeing the watch on the wrist, I just want to remind everyone that at vintagewatchservices.eu you will always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. And as a subscriber, you can use this coupon code for up to 10% off. Alright, there we have it. Matt's Breguet Type 20. Now with the flyback function that it should have. Very handsome and cool watch. Quite complicated to make those parts for it, but also very fun to do. That is what watchmaking is really about. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. I'll be back with another video shortly. Until then,